All right, hello everybody. I think we're going to get started. My name is Eric Zimmerman. I'm one of the faculty at the NYU Game Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening for our talk by Matteo Menapace, who's about to speak to us. Before that happens, I just want to make a few quick announcements. First, I would like to thank our sponsors, some of the folks in the local New York City game scene that help make stuff like this happen. I want to thank Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, Clarkson Potter, and the Peabody Awards. Please help me, join me in thanking them. They help make our event series possible. Now, tonight's event, Matteo talking about his game Daybreak, is part of a larger series of events at NYU that are all focused on investigating, understanding, and doing projects around the climate crisis. So earlier this evening, as part of Playtest Thursday, Matteo was showing off his game Daybreak, and there were some other games there as well that I also want to recognize. So Natalia Andriesky, who is a faculty at NYU, in her first year writing class, they do a project around advocacy, and this year they decided to make that advocacy project tabletop game. So I love the idea that anyone can be a game designer, and so these writing students who were not part of our program or department, most of them, or maybe all of them, making games for the first time, ended up creating a number of games, two of which were continued forward with the help of some of our MFA students here at the Game Center. I would like to recognize those games, Dish It Up and City 2070. If you were involved in it, if you were one of the original designers or one of the MFAs from our program, can you stand up, please? And Natalia, you as well. Natalia's there in the back. Thank you. So we're happy to have your games be part of the evening. So thanks everybody for taking part in that. So now moving on to the main event for this evening. Oh no, one more thing is we have still more events happening at the Game Center. A week from tonight on our Twitch stream is our annual incubator showcase. So we have an incubator at the Game Center where anyone can come, students, graduating students, but other developers as well, and spend time with us getting mentored and getting support to develop their games. So that last year of incubator projects is going to showcase on our Twitch channel. We also have other events coming up. The end of year showcase for all of our graduating students and other students in our program is going to be happening in early May. You can find out more about all of our events at gamecenter.nyu.edu, where you can also sign up to be on our mailing list. So we almost all of our events, I think, are free and open to the public. Actually, at this point, they're all free and open to the public. So we hope you can join us for some of those events. Okay, now getting into the heart of things for tonight, it is really my pleasure and honor to welcome to the NYU Game Center Matteo Menapace. Like many people that are doing interesting things with games, Matteo does not come from a traditional game design background. He's a designer and an educator. He comes from a background of creative coding and other forms of design. He has had an artist residency at the Victoria and Albert Museum around game design. He's taught at Goldsmiths College in London. And today he works as a game designer and also working with companies to sort of bring them into the world of games. He sometimes helps companies make their company culture more playful, or he works with a lot of companies doing work in the public sector that are using games as ways of fostering community or understanding what they're doing maybe in a different way. Doing really interesting, fascinating work. His latest project that he's going to be talking about today is Daybreak. It is not yet released to the public, so we are all seeing it both at Playtest Thursday and tonight as a special sneak preview. Daybreak was a spectacular success on Kickstarter, and I think that for me, it's such a fascinating project on multiple levels. It's interesting in terms of the approach that you take to what do you do with the climate crisis? I think it's an interestingly optimistic utopian game, and I think we're going to talk about that. It definitely takes the idea of simulating a complicated phenomena, and I'm sure that was a huge challenge to figure out how do you abstract this down. And in addition, I think Daybreak is trying to do other things, leverage itself as an example of sustainable game design and publishing in terms of thinking about the materials that were used in its construction and trying to design down and make it a physically sustainable game. At the same time, it's also trying to leverage itself as an educational resource as well. And I think, Matteo, you may be talking about the whole web interface that extends outwards from the tabletop game as well, so that it can be used in multiple contexts. So there's a lot to talk about here. It's an amazing project. I can't wait to hear Matteo talk more about Daybreak. Please join me in welcoming Matteo Menapace.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to talk about Daybreak, which is a cooperative game, board game, about stopping climate change. And as Eric said, it's a game that has an optimistic outlook. So it's not doom and gloom, but it's about what is possible, what can be done about the climate crisis. And it's about creating that space where people can think about the possibilities and imagining a future where we are decarbonizing the world in a just way, and we're all surviving as well as thriving. So I want to share with you what me and the team, I co-designed this with Matt Leacock, what we've learned over 3 years of designing Daybreak, and also I'm going to show you a lot of prototypes. So some of those will be very quick, but if you see anything during that quick tour of the prototypes that pique your interest, I might not be able to stop at that point, but maybe later we can come back to it when we have question and answers. Okay, so Daybreak started in 2020, which was a great year, right? So at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I wrote an article, I wrote a blog post about one of my favorite games, which is Pandemic. How many of you have played Pandemic? Cool. Yes, great. So just briefly, for those of you who haven't played Pandemic, it's a classic cooperative game where you are a team of scientists and medical professionals. You're going around the world to contain the outbreaks of 4 deadly viruses, not 1, but 4. And at the same time, you're sharing information and samples to create cures that will allow you to then eradicate those 4 viruses. So it's a game that came out in 2008, way before the COVID pandemic. But in 2020, it became very real, very actual. And so I wrote a blog about what can we learn from Pandemic. And Pandemic is not trying to be a simulation of an actual pandemic, but there's a lot that we can learn about it in terms of coordination, in terms of how important it is to communicate between players. So I wrote that post, and then a few days later, I found this, which is an op-ed on the New York Times from Matt Leacock, the designer of Pandemic. And that was really inspiring to me, so I reached out to Matt on Twitter. I didn't know Matt at the time. And I said, here's what I wrote. What do you think? And then he replied to me saying, thank you for sharing. And also, he said, I've been doing some research on a climate game, and do you want to have a chat about it? And I was really, really excited about this. So we set up a call, and as we started talking about what could be a game about the climate crisis, we decided to agree on some design principles. So before we started actually designing a game, we decided what kind of game do we want to make, and we were strangers to each other. We still haven't met after 3 years in real life. So we were like, okay, so what kind of game could we do? And the first thing we agreed on was that if we were to make a game about the climate crisis, we wanted it to be about collective action and systemic solutions. Because the climate crisis is a global problem, and we're kind of frustrated with how often climate action is framed as an individual lifestyle. Say, eat less meat, fly less, maybe don't have a kid, which are potentially positive things that you can do, but also the idea of a personal carbon footprint was invented and popularized by BP, British Petroleum. So it's in the interest of the oil industry to actually blame individual people and to say, you know, there are little things that you can do in your life to change, to make your bit, to do your bit about climate change, and to shift the blame. So we wanted the game to be about systemic solutions, systemic change. And we wanted the game to be about real-world data. So to use data about emissions and to show through the game how those emissions are produced, what they create, and to give players a visceral experience of what it means to confront such a big problem. And then we also wanted it to be not educational, or rather not preachy. So educational games tends to have a way to be telling you what to do, to be telling you what the right thing to do is. I'm not saying all educational games, but as a tendency, if you're trying to convince someone to do something, you might tell them, this is the right thing to do, this is the wrong thing to do. But what that does is taking away choices, meaningful choices from players. And we wanted instead to create something which is playable, something that people can try and experiment with, something that doesn't tell you this is right, this is wrong, but rather that gives you a portfolio of solutions based on real world data, as I said before, based on realistic solutions without putting our favorite solutions as the best solutions or the only one that will allow you to win the game. So how do we do that? First, we decided that we would concentrate on modeling the problem, or what we call the what is layer. So the what is essentially burning fossil fuels generates emissions, and emissions drive up global temperatures. And then on top of that layer of problem, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, we would create a what if layer. So what if world powers were to work together to solve the climate crisis at a global level? And this is where we have that imagination gap, that it's not the current reality, but it's one that we could imagine. And within that space, we can show what is possible. So by playing this big question, we can show players what could happen and let them imagine multiple ways to get there in the future. So we started by modeling the problem, the what is layer. And this is an example from an early prototype from, I think, May, June 2020. So what is the problem that players are trying to solve is emissions. So you can see on the top there is the atmosphere. So in the atmosphere, players would dump all the emissions from all sectors from all over the world. And then some of those emissions would be sequestered by the forests and the oceans of the world. That's roughly half of the emissions that humans produce. So we're producing way more than the planet can absorb. So what is not absorbed by the planet is accumulating in the atmosphere, and as it accumulates, is pushing up temperatures. So this is an early sketch of this thermometer that represents global warming, and the higher the temperature, the higher this scale, this crisis rate. So the higher the consequences, the more damaging the consequences of the climate crisis. And this is an early, so that was an early prototype. This is how Daybreak works now. And it hasn't really changed. So that core model is still there. We went through many, many, many iterations, but each round players dump all the equivalent of all anthropogenic emissions into the board. Some of those get sequestered by forests and by oceans, and the rest goes into the thermometer. When it fills up a whole row of the thermometer, it locks in 1/10 of a degree of global warming, and then the higher the temperature, the more damaging, the more intense the consequences. So now I'm going to take you through a very quick through of early prototypes. So you can see things are changing. Okay, so from here to here. So initially, we focused on energy, transitioning from dirty energy to clean energy, and emissions. That was our main focus. So players would have a deck of cards that would allow you to reduce your emissions, like those first two on the top left. And then you have other cards that will allow you to increase the energy, the clean energy production. And then each round you would scribble some numbers here and some numbers here, and then you would draw them down and then take the total and put it into the atmosphere. And that some of it would be sequestered, the rest would push up the temperatures, and you would also have a lot of actions that you could do as general actions. And in our first model, we thought that would be really important to have two different kind of currencies that players would use. The first one is financial capital, so money. The other one would be political power. So at the beginning of the game, each player would get their initial set of money and power, and throughout they would have to increase the amount of money that they could spend on climate solutions, as well as building power to make those easier to pass. And these are some early examples of the crisis cards. So as the temperature rises, you get more of those, and those would cause effects on the planet, or they would make you lose money mostly. So as we started playtesting these initial prototypes, we found that there was something really compelling about trying to reduce the carbon footprint, the global carbon footprint, but at the same time we're starting to get a bit tricky to shoehorn all of the climate policies and all the climate action that we're learning about into something where essentially only emissions count. So we had to do, any kind of emissions, any kind of policy that you can think of, climate policy, we would have to make it somehow fit into either does it put the emissions up or does it put the emissions down? And that starts to feel a little bit too reductive. At the same time, we're also talking to the Red Cross Climate Center, who are doing a lot of really amazing work in preventing the worst consequences of the climate crisis, as well as using games to educate people about what can happen around risk. So in one of our first meetings, our mentor, Pablo Suarez, made a really good point, and he said climate action is not merely a war on carbon. So it is about decarbonizing the entire economy, but it's also about protecting people, protecting ecosystems, protecting our infrastructure from the effects of climate change. So from that conversation, we started thinking about, okay, how can we model this? And we conceptualized it as a circle where you would have people. So you need to protect people. And how do you protect people? You do them by creating social resilience, so protecting society, protecting ecology, and protecting infrastructure. And if the goal of climate action is to protect people by building these different types of resilience, then it would make sense that the loose condition for the game would be that if you have too many people suffering as a result of global warming, then you're lost. So at that point, we hadn't quite fine-tuned the how do you lose or how do you win, the exact numbers, but we thought you win if you reduce emissions to a certain level, let's say net zero, and you lose if you have too many people suffering as a result of climate change. So that creates a dual goal for players. On the one hand, they have to reduce their emissions, and on the other hand, they have to protect people. So to do multiple things at the same time. Okay. So you see that now we have people lost as it appeared in the player board. So that's where you would put the people that you lost as a result of crisis. And we tried out different layouts. They became humans at some point. Then they went into a coffin. Really bad idea. Stayed there for a while. And as we were doing this, we were playtesting, we were learning a lot from people, we were still talking to the Climate Center. And one thing that we realized was that while we were trying to create an accurate model of the carbon cycle, people would have to do maths in order to convert carbon into temperature rise. And it's relatively simple math. So let's say that you have 34 cubes and you have to divide it by 3 players, which means 11 temperature cubes with some rest. But it's not fun to do maths while you're playing. So what we ended up doing was redesigning the thermometer and making so that when you are you're putting directly the carbon into the thermometer. So the carbon goes into the thermometer, and then as it starts filling up the thermometer, you swap it out with temperature. So that was an initial simplification that was also welcomed by the Red Cross in terms of the delay that you could think of happening between temperature, between carbon going into the atmosphere and temperature actually growing. So that ended up being both a simplification of gameplay and a more accurate model of how the emission cycles work. So at that point, we were quite happy with how we modeled the problem. So, and that took about a year. So we're end of 2020, beginning of 2021. We decided to refocus on the what if. So how do we make players solve the problem? And at the same time, we started working with our publisher, CMYK. So CMYK are an independent publisher based in New York, Justin and Alex. Justin actually is an environmental lawyer by day. So they've been really trying to make a game about climate change for years. They reached out to Elizabeth Hargrave, who's the designer of Wingspan, asking if they wanted to collaborate, if she wanted to collaborate. Elizabeth said no, but I know someone who's already working on a climate game, and she passed it on to us. So we started talking to Alex and Justin, and we decided to work together. This is still at a very early stage of the game, where we had a working model of the problem, but we had a lot of work to do on how people would play with it. And so back to this. At this point, the game would take about 3 hours, optimistically, to play, and that's a bit too long for most people. And often playtesters reported feeling overwhelmed when they played, because they had all these different actions they could do. They had a bunch of cards that they could collect, and also they had this budget of financial capital and political power that they had to spend. So it required a lot of brain power, a lot of time for players to decide how to spend it. And it just wasn't an interesting experience. It was just an accounting exercise. So we decided to go back to the drawing board and to remove all the actions, all the standard actions, and instead give people cards that they would play as starting projects. And then we decided to go even further and get rid of money, get rid of political power, simplify even further to move from an economy where you have to use cards instead as a currency. So you have your hand of cards, and in order to do certain actions, you have to spend cards. And because all the cards that you get are potentially good climate policy, you have these difficult decisions that you have to make. So let's say that you get a card about universal public transport. Do I want to invest in universal public transport, or do I want to spend that card to, say, build clean energy plants or to close down coal plants? So this is interesting trade-offs for players, interesting decisions to make, and at the same time a huge simplification of the numbers, because before you would have to say, okay, I've got 20 financial capital, do I spend 8 here and 5 there and 7 there, versus 1, 1, 1, very simple numbers, much more usable. And so the cognitive burden and what people are thinking of when they're playing is not, is 7 plus 8 still within my budget? Is actually, do I want to do this or do I want to do that? What's more important for me? And at the same time, while we radically simplified the gameplay, we decided to open up the space for more granular data about what people would be working with. So up to that point, we had clean energy, dirty energy, and other carbon, very crude model. And this is not how carbon emissions are accounted. So the UN uses these different emission sources. So the bulk of the emissions come from electricity. Then we have transportation, we have heating and cooling of buildings, we have industry that produces a lot of emissions, agriculture and land use, fugitive emissions, i.e. when you're extracting fossil fuels to be burned and create emissions, you're also creating emissions in the process itself, which is not negligible. And then we have waste. So all of those, we took data from 2018, 2019, the most recent data, and then we created some ratios, some tokens that people could play with. So instead of looking at percentages, you would be having, for instance, 1 token equals roughly 5% of the total emissions. So that's one of the spreadsheets that we've been working on at that point, and that's what it looks like in the game itself. So as a player, you have this player board, and on your player board you track a number of things. You track your electricity, so this is dirty electricity. So in order to produce electricity, you have coal plants, for instance, that are not only producing electricity but emissions as well. And then you have clean electricity, which is producing electricity but not emissions. And then you have industry, transportation, buildings, fossil fuel extractions, agriculture, and waste. So one of the things that people want to do, that players would do in order to win, is to reduce the amount of dirty electricity and other sources of emissions. And they can do this by using cards. For instance, this card here allows you to get rid of the dirty electricity sources. So you can think of this as, let's close down a coal plant or a series of coal plants. And this one allows you to build clean electricity. So there are 2 separate actions. Then you also track resilience. So you have your social resilience, no ecological resilience here, and infrastructure resilience. And you can do actions like this to add resilience. And again, you have that trade-off of, I get 5 cards. Those 5 cards are all good cards that potentially I would want to use to do some actions. But if I want to finance some of these policies, I might have to get rid of some of those. So there is that tension built into each card. So let's say you get a increased social resilience card, you could play it on top of an existing card to become the new focus of your policy stack, or you could play it behind. And whenever you do that, you see those tags? These represent the type of policy or technology. So this is society, regulation, infrastructure, ecology, society, and often the actions that you're playing have a multiplier or a limit which allows you to boost the efficiency of the different policies that you're rolling out based on how you play them. So this creates interesting decisions for players to do. And so after a few rounds, the player board looks like this. You might have a player that has invested in solar panels, solar power, and they're able to produce a lot of solar energy for relatively cheap. Or they might have invested in regulations that allow them to close down coal plants and fossil fuel plants more efficiently, and so on. And this is how the game looks currently. So for about 2 years, we've been working with a prototype that had no art and also relatively abstract titles. So we knew that there is a policy that allows you to increase social resilience, but we decided that we would focus on the dynamics of the game first, and then once we had those dynamics working in a way that we felt was engaging and also shortened, we would work with an expert, say experts in social resilience, to tell us, okay, what does this abstract card look like in the real world? And that might be universal healthcare, for instance. So really important to work with experts to have that translation between the game mechanics and what they represent in the real world. So now we have a deck of about 150 solution cards, for example, microgrids. And those cards allow you to, in this case, add infrastructure resilience. And they are multiplied by one of those tags. So the more tags with this finance symbol you have, the more infrastructure resilience you can create. And then let's say that you get a card in your hand that has high-speed rail. It has one of those symbols, so potentially you could put it behind this stack to make microgrids even more efficient, or you could play it in front here to invest massively in rail transportation and reduce your transportation emissions. So this ability to add cards behind or in front of others creates a really exciting experience where you see the power of your policies building up at the same time as the climate, at the same time as global warming is building up. So you have this dynamics of players getting better and better and better at doing things, but at the same time you have the temperatures growing, the crisis getting more damaging, and essentially you win the game when you become better. The ability for you to do positive climate actions outstrips the rising of temperatures. So you have these two competing loops within the game. So let's talk about the art. So the art has been commissioned by CMYK. We decided to work with artists from all around the world because we have a game that is effectively about decarbonizing the whole world. So we've been working with, I think 12, but probably more, 12 artists from all over the world to create a rich world that inspires people to take action, that something that shows you what that solution could look like at scale. Now back to the prototypes. So while this was happening, while the artists were being commissioned and started to produce all the art, we went back to trying out different layouts for the player board, and also one thing that Alex and Justin CMYK brought in was a sustainability lifecycle consultant. So as Eric mentioned earlier, we didn't just want to make a game about climate crisis. We also wanted to make a game that is of the lowest possible footprint as a product, to set an example for sustainable production. And by bringing in someone who can look at the footprint, the effect of all of your game materials, we were able to also make design decisions. So it's not just about reducing or eliminating plastic from the products. It's not just about using recycled paper or less impactful inks. It's also about how those early decisions then impact how you design. So, for example, you have the planetary effects here. So we had this solution at that point where imagine you have a bag with a lot of tokens. Each token would be referring to a different type of planetary effect. So you draw them from a bag, and then you start filling up those tracks. And that worked really well. And from a design point of view, it allowed us to have a very fine-tuned control over how many tokens of this type do we want, how many tokens of the other type do we want. But then our sustainability advisor, Ruth, told us that having a cloth bag filled with potentially plastic chips, but even wooden chips, was not a great solution from a manufacturing point of view. So we went back to the drawing board, and we decided to instead try and use a die. So the die is a slightly more crude solution because you don't have that fine grain control, but at the same time it works. And also, as we started playtesting, we realized that the die brings in that element of excitement and drama, and it really resonated with playtesters and with our mentors. So yeah, it means that, let me show you a bigger thing. So we're using more sustainable components, and at the same time we have something that is more exciting for players to play. Okay, so now, just briefly, imagine that you're interested in making a game that is about a problem or a system. So where do you start? We took this approach, which is to first define the problem that players would try to solve, so the what is scenario, and then on top of that, build a set of gameplay that allows people to try out different solutions. So what if I do this? What if I do that? And at the same time, I would advise to not try and make your game educational, in the sense that if you're trying to tell people what is the right thing to do, then you might be limiting their choices. And it might be okay for one play or two plays, but at some point people will become bored or just will switch off because they don't like to be told what to do. Because essentially, by preaching, you're taking away the agency that players have or that players want. So how do you make a choice meaningful? Well, first of all, the choice has to be non-obvious. So if there is an obvious choice that people can do and will lead to positive results, then they will do that, and that's an obvious choice. There needs to be something about the choices that people have that makes them really think about, should I do this or should I do that? And they're similarly desirable. And also the choices that people make within the game should have a meaningful impact on the game itself. It shouldn't be just something that you do performatively or something that looks good but has no effect on the game itself. So, whoops. Oh, I'm still there. Okay. So if you're trying to do that, I think a question that really helps is for people to think, are we pushing players to a specific or an optimal choice? And if yes, then it means that you need to rebalance. are there multiple ways for players to win or to reach their goals? Because if there's only one, then you're either making a puzzle or you're making a preacher game. And finally, are the players playing the game, or is the game playing them? Because if that's the case, then again, you're not really playing a game. You're not making choices. And the final point that I want to make about making games that create a space for people to explore problems is to consider making it a cooperative game. Because when you're making a cooperative game, the antagonist, the enemy, is often the game itself. So you can encode in the model of your system directly the game mechanics, and you don't need other players to be the problem. You don't need them to roleplay, and this also means that you don't have to second guess what other people are doing. You can collaborate as players on bigger problems, because you can work as a team, and you'll also get much richer picture of what people are thinking. Because often in a cooperative game, people are talking to each other, so you'll get a lot of really, really interesting conversations happening at the table, and you'll get people to work together at solving bigger problems. So I hope that was informative as a quick tour through 3 years of development. If you want to dig more into it, go to blog.daybreakgame.org. We have a series of design diaries where we dissect all of the things that I briefly showed you in much more detail. And yeah, any questions? Over there.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Do we need to turn these on, by the way?
The wireless ones, yeah.
The wireless ones we need to turn on. So, hello, hello. Okay, you can hear me now. Wow, that was delightful to get such a detailed look at your game, at your process. I think seeing screens and screens of prototypes for a game designer, it's sort of our form of pornography. I think just like drooling and gesturing at the screen. So, or maybe I'm just talking about myself. But there's definitely a lot for us to talk about with this game. I don't even know where to start. I think maybe I'm going to jump in and I want to, because you talk so much about the details of the mechanics, I want to take a few steps back and maybe ask a question that's obvious, but maybe not so obvious. Let's talk about, or here's what I'm curious to hear about, Matteo. How would you articulate what you feel is your theory of change of the game? In other words, you're clearly did your homework, very passionate about this subject, trying to figure out how you as a game designer can approach this complex topic. What's your hope in terms of, because this is Daybreak versus the climate crisis. Is that what the name of the talk was? Yeah. So how do you see that versus? Like what? Yeah. How do you see Daybreak having an impact?
Yeah, I think primarily Daybreak can help people create. Can you hear me?
I'm just moving a little closer.
Yeah. Yeah. So Daybreak can work really well at helping people build their own mental model of how climate crises work. So to really understand the scale and the urgency of the problem, and then to be exposed to a wealth of solutions, and understand also that all those solutions can work together in many different ways, that there is no single solutions that will always work or will just work on its own, but that there is such a variety and such a big tapestry of solutions that have to work together. So that's one thing, if you like. The educational value of Daybreak is that it helps you think about the climate crisis in a way that, for me personally, and also from many other people that have played it, they didn't get from other media. They didn't get from reading climate books or from watching documentaries. That is that understanding that allows you to filter climate news or any news announcement from politicians through what you've seen in the game, and then saying, well, but that's not enough, or that's just going to be too small a change for what we really need. So to really make people understand the scale and the urgency of the crisis, the solutions that exist, and then to hopefully focus them on one or two things that they want to learn more about and maybe get involved with.
Okay, I want to agree and disagree with you, if I can, about that. Or let's say I want to acknowledge that I think what you're saying is true, but also maybe push back a little bit too, in the spirit of kind of respectful dialogue, and see where we go with this.
Okay.
In the way that I agree with you, I also have to say that, the game is not published yet. We had a sneak preview out there today. I was looking in detail as it was being played, and I was thinking to myself, this was really complicated, right? That this I think the danger that you articulated, that it does feel like a sort of big accounting problem, right, or big math problem. I had a moment of that, but as that first turn was happening, and I was like, I was sort of helping one of the players play. I was sort of almost playing the game with them. And there's a moment when you're adding up your emissions and all the excess is like, oh my gosh, carbon is going into the atmosphere. And you're putting this stuff up at the top of the board, the cubes. And then suddenly it's like, okay, well, let's see how the planet does. Oh, I see, this is being absorbed by the ocean, by the forest. And you're sort of getting rid of them, or you're seeing that they're being absorbed, and then there's leftover. The leftover goes into the thermometer, and then there was enough to raise it by 1/10 of a degree. So, and I have to say that I did have a kind of aha moment there, right? That there's a sense in which that sort of overall process is made incredibly clear. And I think that one of the ways that board games are interesting is that it's visual, it's cognitive, mathematical, it's kinetic, it's tactile, it's social, it's logical. It's sort of like somehow it's firing in all of those ways. And I think that you're right that it brings a systemic problem to life in a way that few other media can. Not even a video game, because the thing about a tabletop game is the CPU is running in our heads, and in a sense that we are the ones urging it forward and making it happen, right?
Yeah,
and so
we're
sort
the game
of
engine.
Yeah. So that's a sense in which I very much agree with you, and I think that I really felt a kind of intellectual vertigo, like oh, like I'm seeing how all of these parts fit together, and I'm sure that there's other things that can happen in terms of the resources of the game and the possible programs. The question that I still have about the theory of change is sort of brought up by what you said at the very beginning. I thought that was very poignant that you said this idea of individual action, right? As you put it, like, reduce your individual carbon footprint. That's something that's was invented by British Petroleum, which I didn't know. And it's a sort of something sponsored by the fossil fuel industry, right? And also, just to bring the kind of, just so that you don't feel alone, just to bring my kind of respectful criticism to NYU as a whole, the whole NYU 2040 event, it has a set of, here's our tips and suggestions for what to do, right? And it's, you don't know about this, but it's things about good things that we all should be doing, eating less meat, recycling more, reusing things instead of buying new things, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, NYU is completely invested in the fossil fuel industry. There's actually a very large student and faculty and staff movement to try and get the university to divest, right? And so I think that needs to be said in the context of this bigger event. And so that's also that's where I'm also thinking about. Ideally, something like Daybreak is a kind of is some kind of lever, right? For making change or having an impact. And so I don't know, do you see, so beyond the experience of an individual playing the game and having that intellectual moment, how do you see the game being leveraged, I don't know, in other contexts, maybe in a research context or in a more political context or in an educational context?
Yeah, we've been already talking to people who are planning to use Daybreak in leadership training, for instance. So because of the reasons that you mentioned earlier, the experience of playing Daybreak giving you that clarity, that systemic understanding, and at the same time helping you navigate these really difficult decisions that you have to make, and the type of leadership that or the leadership training that we've had in the past up to now is used to linear changes. So what worked 10 years ago will work in 10 years' time, and that's no longer the case. So by playing Daybreak, by testing out different ways in which you could react to that, we are working actively with leadership training. That's one way to bring Daybreak beyond the main audience, which is ultimately all of you, people who play games, people who maybe want to talk about climate, but they don't feel like bringing up the subject at a dinner table or in a conversation. So this is a way to bring climate within culture, within conversations, and to help people see both the problem and the possible solutions. So I think Daybreak works as a base for that kind of initial understanding and reorienting from all the good things that we can do, like recycling, eating less meat, and so on and so on. But at the same time, when you play Daybreak, you realize that it's just not enough. And we need the kind of more radical, more progressive, more systemic change that recycling won't bring us there.
And there's other vectors to the game that I don't think you've brought up yet. For example, tell us about those little QR codes on each card.
Yeah, so each
that
card,
some of you may have noticed in the screenshots.
Yeah, so each card will have a QR code. You scan the QR code and you will get to a page. On the page, you will be able to learn... A web page, yes. You'll be able to learn more about what the card does. So if you have any doubts or any questions about how do I play this, what does this mean, you'll be able to clarify them there. We'll have some design notes. So Matt and I will be writing, why do we do that and what does it mean for us? But more importantly, we'll have experts explaining in a simple language what does that solution or crisis mean? How does it manifest in the world? And what could you do if you wanted to learn more about it or take action? So there's sort of bridge between playing the game and being that magic circle where a great future is possible and is happening, or you can make it happen with your friends, to things that you could do in the real world to bring about that change, that systemic change that we spoke about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I'm asking you these questions because they're also the questions I'm asking myself as I try and think about, how to do design in a way that impacts the world in a positive way, or that shifts things in a way that could make things better. I, like you, I agree that sort of systems thinking is, in general, is a good thing. Being playful is a good thing. The kind of sociality around tabletop games, but can we do more? So yeah, so it's very interesting for me to think about how, for example, as you say, what are the conversations that this game could start, or what are the ways that this game can be, as you say, an example of sustainable publishing.
Yeah. And it's also, as I mentioned before, we didn't want to make an educational game, and then I said that there is, of course, an educational element to it. But the way in which I think it's not educational is that you can bring Daybreak to a table and not say, you don't have to be pro or against any of the particular solutions, but you can see by playing what could happen if you roll out some of the solutions within the game. So, for instance, there's geoengineering. Are people familiar with geoengineering? more or less. Okay, so geoengineering are technologies such as spraying gases in the atmosphere or in the stratosphere that would artificially create clouds that would then lower the temperatures. And these are technologies that tend to be very risky, but at the same time also very cheap compared to other types of solutions. So
risky because we don't know unintended effects.
Yeah, because messing with planetary systems is not something that we can completely control or that we haven't quite figured out how to do. But at the same time, it's something that could happen in the future because conceivably a nation, a country could decide to just roll it out as a preventive measure. As potential breakdowns of international collaboration could happen in the future, we could see this kind of unilateral initiatives that bring about positive but also unknown, potentially very damaging effects. And you can play that in Daybreak. I'm personally very scared about it, but I also feel that it is something that could happen in the future, and it is almost like a duty for us as designers to put it in there and to not just censor it because we don't agree personally with it.
That kind of brings me to another set of questions that I wanted to ask you about. And I think that, there's a sense in which every game designer is a world builder, right? Mm-hmm. But I think beyond that, what's interesting when you are taking such a specific topic is that you're really theorizing, in a sense, through your game, right? Through how the game represents its subject matter, through how you choose to depict it, because every game is a radical stylization of its topic. It's a toy version of some aspect of the real world. Yeah. And your game does that in interesting ways, right? So just to give one example, the 4 players of the game, if you're playing with a full 4 people, that you've decided to sort of stylize the sort of world powers into are the United States, China, Europe, and the global majority, or majority world. Majority world, it's called. So I think it's sort of a bold stylization, right? One could see that as a privileging of the global north, or one could see it as a critique of the global north in some way, because this is where those responsible for negative emissions are. Can you talk about either that example or the kind of decisions you had to make in thinking about these, the way that you stylized and your subject matter?
Yeah, so a lot of the decisions that we put into Daybreak come from research that Matt and I have been doing, conversations that we had, for example, with Red Cross Climate Center. We've been reaching out to authors of books that we really found inspiring and that helped us clarify our own understanding of the climate crisis. So in particular, there's a book called 100% Solution that we read early on in the process, and then we reached out to the author, Solomon Colston-Rose, and those conversations and also him play testing the game helped us a lot, bringing the subject matter, the theories, and the solutions that the plan essentially that he's explaining throughout the book into a playable form. We've been working closely with Laurie Laban, who's the co-author of a book called Planets on Fire, which takes a more systemic look at not just decarbonizing the economy, but also building different forms of finance, different forms of public ownership. So all of the kind of transformative policies that we need to enable the kind of decarbonization and the kind of resilience building that is required. So back to the 4 players. In the 100% solution, Solomon says that there are countries like the US and China who can make a difference, just on their own. So if the United States decided to rapidly and radically decarbonize, that would create such a momentum and such a push that other countries would have to follow. And you can say a similar thing for China. Europe was also included as not a country, but a trading bloc, but that tends to work in unison when it comes to climate negotiations. And then the majority world, we initially called it Global South, which is how it's generally referred to in the Global North. So these are the countries that are the least responsible historically for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And at the same time, there are the countries or the people that are the most affected by what we're already feeling in terms of the negative effects of climate change. So we wanted them to have, by them I mean the actual majority of the world. So most people live in countries that call themselves the majority world, and we wanted them to have a role, an active role to play, an empowering role, while at the same time acknowledging that it's very challenging and that they're already, so the majority world, for instance, starts with communities in crisis, so with it starts closer to a potential loss because there is already that level of suffering, of damage that has happened, which we haven't felt in the global north. And at the same time, there are countries and people who I think have the right to grow it, to engage, to have better living conditions. And the challenge there is for them to grow in a way that is not how we grow in the global north, not with a fossil fuel economy, but to actually leapfrog all that development into a greener development, if you like.
And in fact, I think all of the players are pulling their policies from a similar deck.
Yes.
So from the same deck.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
In that sense, I think I saw in some of your earlier prototypes, the cards were per player. These are the China cards, right? But I guess later on, the idea is, as you say, you're sort of democratizing the policies.
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe I'll ask one more big question before we open it up to the audience, and that's thinking about what you're saying about how you're modeling the world. I think one of the interesting things is the sort of optimistic point of view of Daybreak, right? So it's sort of in your what is, what if. So what you posited the what is through a lot of data and research, and it's wonderful to see like the care that you took in trying to produce this accurate model, even as you try to stylize it and actually make it fun, right? Like that's always and not an accounting problem. And still make it a way for people to explore the systemic problem, I think, as you put it. But the what if is, I think, as you say, remarkably optimistic. And I think maybe the one big thing is just the idea that, all these world powers are just going to collaborate together and not compete with each other in order to sort of work together in a spirit. And it's interesting that you kind of decided to make Daybreak an optimistic game. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So that was a conscious decision. We wanted the game to feel empowering and optimistic and hopeful because Matt and I and all the people that we collaborated with have felt at some point this kind of despair or feeling overwhelmed by what is happening, feeling overwhelmed by the inaction, or that sometimes there is a bit of hope, a bit of momentum building, and then things go back or to business as usual. So we wanted the game to have this positive outlook, maybe just also for our own mental health, to feel more positive about what could happen. And then I guess when you create a game, you have to decide where does the game start and when does it end. So obviously the world is not going to end when Daybreak ends. It's not going to end if or when temperatures reach or exceed certain thresholds. But as game designers, we have to put those boundaries, and we decided that for us it was very interesting and important to say, okay, assuming that we have elected or we have brought to power leaders or people that are taking the climate crisis seriously and are willing to change the way that we organize society in the way that is required by the crisis, that is still an interesting challenge to play out. So, and then where does it end? It's the moment where you have stopped the problem from getting worse. So the moment where the emissions are not going up. Because one of the big things that we realized while learning about climate change in general is that the problem is really not the emissions that we are producing, but is the fact that these emissions keep on accumulating and stay in the atmosphere for a really long time. So even if we were to stop tomorrow to, magically produce emissions, we would still have all the emissions that we have produced historically in the global north and in the global south. So it's that moment where you're stopping the problem from getting worse, and you're starting to get to a more positive trajectory on that curve, and that's why we decided to put the boundaries of the game. But there's a lot of space to explore, say, in what happens between now and the moment where Daybreak starts, and then also what happens after Daybreak ends in either a positive or a negative way.
I remember I mentioned this to you, but I saw Paolo Pedercini, who's well known for his very agitating political work as a game designer, and he gave a talk recently at Cooper Union here in New York City, and he mentioned that his latest game that he gave us a sneak preview of is also sort of a future utopian game, and he said he felt like making a game that was optimistic felt like a radical act, because he feels like there's so much doom and gloom with everything from, I don't know, climate change to conspiracy theorizing to AIs to the world seems to be sort of caught in a dystopian moment. So for him, that was a kind of a radical act. And I don't know, maybe Daybreak we also can see as also having that kind of radical utopian sort of idea.
Yeah, hopefully. And as we were researching Daybreak, one of the things that really helped was to switch to, not just switch, but to balance all the non-fiction that we were reading and all of the reports and the doom and gloom, if you like, or the projections for a really dire future with science fiction. So, for instance, we read and took a lot of inspiration from a book called The Ministry for the Future, which is a novel about what could happen, again, if you have this powerful group of people who take decisions about climate action. And there are a lot of ideas that are explored in the Ministry for the Future that we didn't feel were relevant for us, so that would be not quite fitting with the system that we developed. But that was really interesting. And I mean, personally, also I've been switching more to science fiction as a way to ask those bigger questions, because sometimes when you stick to just what is happening now, what has been happening in the past, you kind of limit your imagination.
I think the big challenge is, again, it's interesting to think about a game that's positing the future, but in a sense to anchor it in the now, and in not what's happening in the game, but in the world in which the game itself is happening, right? Yeah. The lives of the players or those communities, and how that's I guess that's what my mind keeps on thinking about, is how a game like Daybreak can be more than just an exercise and really a lever for changing either people's lives or the world in some way.
And also we didn't want it to look futuristic. One of the things that Alex, the the art director was very clear with the artist, was that we don't want a sci-fi kind of vibe to it. We want it to look like, you know, the trains that we have in parts of the world, in Europe, in Japan, and so on. If we were to scale up that technology, that solution to every other part of the world, it's not science fiction. It's something that already exists. So I mentioned things like geoengineering, which are luckily science fiction at the moment, but most of the solutions that you see in Daybreak are actually already existing.
Which is, I think, part of the message of the game, right? This is happening now. These are solutions that could happen now.
Yeah.
That maybe what's missing is the will or the sense of cooperation that's existing in the game.
Yeah.
Let's open it up for questions. I'd love to hear. There's a question in the back. Logan, I think you were going to take the mic. Yeah, Matt in the back on the right.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I am really interested in this subject. We've chatted about it a little bit. Ministry for the Future, great recommendation, by the way. Anyone who's interested, was my co-founder's inspiration for starting a climate change org. My first question, I have two questions. The first one is, Daybreak ends at 2 degrees Celsius, not 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
How tough a decision, I agree, but there's a lot of people who still say that 1.5 is the cutoff and the goal. So how difficult was the decision was for you to draw the line there? Because you could just play with the numbers, right? To make it 1.5 instead of 2.
Yeah.
So that is clearly like a choice for you about what you think is realistic. And the second question is that you put things in the game that even you think are maybe problematic, like geoengineering. But I know that there's other things in the games like nuclear power, or my personal favorite, carbon removal, that lots of environmental organizations and environmentalists sort of object to. I was wondering if you've gotten much pushback on those from people in the environmental industry.
Okay, so the first question is about temperature limits. So 1.5 versus 2 degrees. And I mean, all numbers are arbitrary in a sense because planetary systems don't work with the numbers that we put on them. But at the same time, something we have tried to model with Daybreak is, as people are generally familiar with these limits, with 1.5, the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees, and beyond, to really show them that even though the number looks just like half a degree of difference, when you play Daybreak, you realize that there's a huge difference in the severity of the crisis, to the effects that hit you at 1.5 versus 1.8, 1.9. And so often people play Daybreak and they win beyond 1.5. It's really hard to win Daybreak and staying below 1.5. But you really experience that difference. And so one way to see it is how, by playing this game, by seeing the non-linear effects of this temperature growing, you start to get a much, much better understanding, and maybe you realize that it's not just half a degree, that in reality every tenth of a degree can be so damaging. So that's to respond to your first question. The other one was about more controversial solutions, such as nuclear power, carbon removal, and so on. Yeah, I mean, we do get a bit of pushback from people we talk to, or from people that play Daybreak, and this is something that I feel the website will do a lot of work on in explaining why we included that solution, what kind of role that solution can play within the bigger picture. And again, we don't think that any solution is 100% perfect or would always work in any situation. There are, for instance, with nuclear power, we have included ways from our understanding, nuclear power can play a role, provided that is deployed in a safe, in a very regulated way. So, and again, having those conversations is still important. I think if people play Daybreak and then have I'm pro-nuclear, I'm versus nuclear conversation after they play, I'd be very happy with that. So I think including those controversial topics is a way to push that conversation forward.
And also, while I'm thinking of it, because that was Matt Parker that asked the question, NYU Game Center faculty, this Friday, which is tomorrow evening, on Washington Square, as part of the NYU 2040 events, Matt is hosting the culmination of a years-long carbon removal challenge, which is actually a design challenge to develop technologies and concepts that will actually remove carbon from the air. So Matt, that's been amazing work that you've been doing with teams around the globe of students and researchers. So just wanted to plug that for anyone that's interested in attending. Other questions? We'll go, the hands that I saw, it looks like maybe we'll get to everyone. We'll try and, let's go back here and then we'll come around, see if we can get to everybody.
Hi, you talked about how projects and action cards in the game are more about radical movements like policy changes. And I'm curious, how do you envision the message being able to deliver to more smaller individual levels, like a person can really make a difference in their day-to-day life throughout the gameplay?
Yeah, I think generally people who play Daybreak are probably already doing their bit individually. So I feel like we don't need to convince them that recycle is important, or those small, and I'm saying that respectfully, small individual actions. I think what we're trying to do is to really put forward a message that in order to meet the scale and the urgency of the climate crisis, we can't just tell people to do their bit individually. And yeah, so it's as simple as that, really. We just made a conscious decision not to put in those small individual actions, because there are other games that do that, and they have their value. For instance, there's a game called Tiny Footprint, which is aimed at families and kids, and that allows you to, it's a cooperative game, it allows you to play out the impact that those individual actions or household actions can have on your life. So there is a game already that does that. We think that Daybreak has a different scale.
My sense, you're much more plugged into the sort of environmental movement than I am. Right. My sense today is that more and more I meet people that are climate activists that are very critical of, as you mentioned, the sort of the BP, the fossil fuel endorsed idea that individual actions are what need to happen. Again, just to point out that that's what NYU is urging us to do, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But really the divestiture from fossil fuel industry, the larger policy questions, I think, are what are really going to make a global impact.
Yeah, and I think that all of those actions are important. I don't want to say don't do those, but I also want to be critical about the effect that those could have. So you might be doing, switching your light bulbs to LEDs and recycling and all of the things that BP tells you to do, essentially, and then feel that that's enough. And that's the problem.
Let's keep going in the back, in the middle, and then we'll see if we can come around.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious, from a design perspective, you did a lot of work with consultants, and I'm sure you learned a lot while making this game. If you ever, it sounds like you had a lot of moments where the consultants actually made the game better in a way because it helped you simplify, but I'm wondering if at any point you kind of had an idea for the game or a design solution that you just couldn't mesh in with like the reality of what you were trying to portray, and whether you had to abandon the idea or how you worked around that?
Yeah, lots. So our strategy is to have a document where anything that we can't put into this current version of Daybreak, we put into the future versions. So it's a way to let go of things that you really would like to include, but sometimes you have to make those difficult choices, and keeping them in a place where you could still revisit them is, I think, a good strategy. At least it works for me, because then they're just out of sight, out of mind. But I know that if I want to, I could come back to it and make a game about that specific thing that I didn't put in Daybreak.
Nearby hand there. Okay.
Hi, Matteo. Sorry, I have a question for Eric, which I'm not asking tonight at home. We're partner. Can a department, instead of individual professor and student that been campaigning for not having fossil fuel investment in NYU, can a whole department become a signatory of that, the game center? Our livelihood, your salary, it depends on that, right? All of the fee and everything that the student is putting in NYU, which is a lot, is going in fossil fuel investment. So I'm just wondering if the whole department can push for something.
I'm seeing Naomi Clark, our chair, nodding. I love that idea. I think.
And honestly, you're in one of the department that's catchy and cool. You know, everyone.
For some, if you say so. Yeah, great idea. I agree that I appreciate the urging and the nudge. I think we all can be advocating for more radical positions and more uncomfortable positions, both for ourselves and for the institutions that we should take more responsibility for. So thank you so much for that suggestion. Let's keep going around. I think there was some hands. Yeah, right here. But we'll go here and then we'll bounce over. Yeah.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you structure the process of research. So I know you did a lot of it. And also, in some of the more controversial solutions that you included, where they're controversial because you don't really know what might happen, and there's sort of potential risks. Did you incorporate those risks and those potential consequences into the game, and if so, how?
Okay, so about research, we spent a few months reading various books. So mainly books that had a decarbonization focus. So we didn't necessarily go and read the reports from the UN, because they tend to be really technical and almost too much. But reading the summaries or reading more accessible versions of those. And then we dived into, I guess, climate justice and understanding how the problem is not just about decarbonizing the world, but also it's about creating popular policies that can gain support from a wide variety of people. So understanding what has worked and what hasn't worked in climate politics so far. So it's really a process of reading a lot of books, listening to podcasts, having this conversation. When you read a book, I personally, when I read a book and I enjoy it, I always try to email the author and then see what happens. And obviously not all authors reply, but if one or two do, then you have that really amazing, enriching conversation, and then you can have a dialogue where you bring to them your ideas, and they come back, they respond with a lot of insights and generosity. So I guess the process is finding your sources, and then try to reach out to them and speak to them.
Oh, that's a great tip. I love that. I love that idea.
There was also another point about the controversial solutions.
About how
and the risks.
Right, how the risks
yeah, so to give you an example,
modeled in the game.
Back to geoengineering. So geoengineering, imagine that the potential of geoengineering is that you can reduce the temperature. So you can reduce, temporarily, you can reduce the severity of the crises that are going to hit you. But before you do that, you have to roll a die. And then based on the number that you roll, you would either get little consequences or very damaging consequences. So that's how you put in the risk. And we've gone through a lot of different prototypes. Also, again, we reached out to geoengineering experts, people that are trying to bring some kind of global governance over this field. And as you can imagine, they would want a game about geoengineering. Right. But we had to kind of simplify it and say,
right.
Yeah,
well, we got a card.
Daybreak, yeah.
We got a card.
Daybreak is not just about geoengineering,
right.
But I mean, it's really interesting also when you have this conversation that as an expert, you want your field of expertise to be
right.
surfaced and to have the kind of attention and the kind of detail that you feel is important. And so you have to push back a bit and say, okay, maybe if we make the Daybreak geoengineering expansion, then that idea will go into the game. But that was one of the cards that we spent quite some time back and forth and trying different solutions and then simplifying to the one that, again, with the die, which is not one of my favorite tools when it comes to board games, but sometimes it really works.
Speaking of geoengineering, I think that the Ministry of the Future in that book, geoengineering is one of the big drivers, right, for what the tipping point of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
As a designer who kind of also wants to make games that are, grounded in science, grounded in reality, I always feel a tension between, the actual numbers, the reality of how things work, and what's actually fun to play. Because often, if the numbers are right, then the game sucks. So, just listening from your presentation, it seems like you focus more on recreating the feeling, the actual system's dynamics of how things work, and then making nice numbers that support that. I guess how do you go about resolving that? The tension between wanting to make things accurate and wanting a game that's good to play.
Yeah.
Classic game design dilemma, right?
Yeah. So with Daybreak, as I mentioned, we started from something that we felt was accurate and unplayable or barely playable, that would last 3 hours and that nobody apart from our partners and our loved ones would really want to play. So you go through that process of removing complexity and understanding that most players don't really care too much if the model is not as accurate as a scientific model, because you're not creating something that is going to be played by could be played by scientists, but the main point is not to create an accurate simulation that is used to make decisions or to make prediction or to that requires that kind of accuracy. Is more about, as you said, having a feeling, an intuitive understanding, and really focusing on the dynamics that emerge from the rules.
Right. I guess one answer is that it's more about process than data.
Yeah.
That understanding the process, the causes and effects, the kind of cyclical patterns is more important than the details of the exact simulation data.
Yeah, exactly. And so I guess a question that could help that process is to think about what do you want people to get away from this game, to come away with from this game. What do you want them to remember? What do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to know? And probably it's not the numbers. I mean, I've been looking at a lot of numbers throughout this development that I wouldn't remember on top of my head. What is the total of emissions that we are producing as humanity each year? And to a certain extent, it doesn't matter, because understanding gigatons is such an unreal and not tangible measure. But understanding the process, as Eric said, that leads to that is much more important.
I realize we're running pretty long, and we probably need to wrap up very, very soon. Naomi, are there any questions from online that you wanted to raise? You're usually monitoring this, or are there? Oh, yes, there are. Carl has some. Okay, so maybe one more burning question from the audience.
Yeah. Also, if you want to reach out on Twitter, I'm still on Twitter, so you can message me.
All right. Any questions quite different than anything we've had so far online?
Herbie TEA asks, were there any adjustments or lessons you learned while collaborating on a tabletop game completely online?
So you were collaborating with Matt Leacock online, really testing, I guess, on Tabletop Simulator or something like that.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I learned, and probably Matt has been doing this for longer than me, was to keep a project diary. So everything that we discussed, everything that we would try out would go into this shared document. At some point, it was like 200 pages long, so we had to split it into 2 documents. And over time, we've built this really detailed, accurate log of everything that we tried out. So we worked a lot asynchronously, just because of time differences. So we meet once a week, 5 p.m. UK time, 9 a.m. California. And then we go off and do our own experiments. We document them, pictures, impressions, and so on. And then, we regroup the week after to see what happened and make some design decisions together.
Thanks for that. Any final burning questions? Okay, I see multiple hands. Go ahead, and then let's see. This may be the last one.
Hi, sorry. I feel like a lot of environmentalism games nowadays focus on sort of a futurism with the removal of humans as the solution. And I really appreciate that this is a systemic solution that incorporates humans into it. And I was wondering if you had any opinion on what attracts that kind of viewpoint, that like the ultimate solution is just removing people from the problem, like shooting them off of the planet to another planet, or...
So you're saying that environmental games remove people?
Environmentalism games nowadays focus on the idea of like fixing the environment and then removing humans from the world as much as possible, like moving people into cities and then leaving wide open tracts of completely untouched lands, or moving humans off of planets. And I was wondering if you had any opinion on what the merits or why people were attracted to that kind of design or philosophy.
I think there's a big difference between, say, rewilding environments or ecosystems, or sending people to Mars. I think to an extent it's a choice that comes from privilege. That, for instance, the debate of sorts around overpopulation tends to be pushed by people who have a much higher personal carbon footprint than the people that they blame, but it's a convenient one. So to say, look at all these people in Africa procreating like mad, and the problem is overpopulation. So I think it's really important to distinguish, to understand what could be the worst outcome of policies or proposals that at first might sound good or agreeable. Yeah, and I guess back to your question, I don't know why they're so popular, but at the same time there is a variety there. There is, I mean, I think that rewilding, for instance, is something that, when done properly, can be very positive. I wouldn't advocate to go to Mars. So, I mean, it's also a question of fantasy in a sense. Like, a lot of the games are exploring a fantasy world where it's easier to create a world and for that world not to have any boundaries or anything that could lead to criticism. That's why a lot of the games that, for instance, are about colonialism tend to be about the colonialism that happened 200 or 300 years ago, because there's enough distance in the past that nobody's going to complain about it, potentially. Whereas if you do them about neo-colonialism, then you would have more consequences. I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yeah. That great final question. I think that really brings us back to this idea of what does it mean to create a fantasy or representation that is about our world, that's trying to envision maybe a different world or solutions, but in the end is really less about that than about what its impact is on the people that are playing it, or on the resonance that the game can have within culture. This has been, I know that we went long, but only because you had such amazing, detailed, nuanced questions. Please join me in thanking Matteo for this amazing evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When is the game out?
So the game is out for those who backed it next month. And then I'd say July for the rest of you.
All right. So this summer we'll be playing Daybreak.
Yes,
and next week, join us for the Incubator stream. Thanks again, Matteo.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody,
for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.